See, I told you that was going to be a quick break. And when I say it's going to be a quick break, they're very quick breaks. We'll see with our new format if we're still able to do that. I don't know. Well, I want to go ahead and welcome Thomas Purcell to the show. And if you are not familiar with his full bio, it is on thebrennerbrief.com and our show information for tonight with the prep and everything about our guests. So, Thomas, I want to welcome you to the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Sara Marie. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. Well, you have a new book among
Yes, I do.
your many, and it fits right into what we've been talking about here tonight with Second Amendment issues, and it's called Shotgun Republic. Tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and we're going to be shipping to some bookstores in the Southwest. But what it is it's a debate. It's really a thumbnail sketch of the gun control debate, and it's not very long. It's 130 pages. It makes it affordable, and it's simple, and it's written a little bit more concisely than my blogs are, a little bit easier to read style. What it is, and the reason I wrote it was because I'm a very big proponent of social media, and I get a lot of angry mails, hate mails, that kind of thing. And most of these mails, when we were getting into the gun control issue in the last couple of months, were grossly uneducated on the meaning and the background of the Second Amendment. And I felt that a lot of people needed some sort of thumbnail education on where the Second Amendment comes from, the history behind it, the meaning of the words, and why we have it.
And so in this book, I know part of what you talk about is the Second Amendment and what kind of a role it plays in a civilized society. And part of what we were talking about in the first 20 minutes of the show is really how in Boston terrorism won in a way because it allowed for people to be terrorized because you no longer have a culture of people defending their own homes, their own property. They rely on the police. You know, they don't all own guns anymore. And, of course, in Boston, it's very challenging anyhow. What is the role in a civilized society?
Well, look, in regards to Boston, you saw what happened. We had two men hold an entire city of millions of population in lockdown. And we had them, what they did was they accomplished what they wanted. They killed people. They made people beholden to their government. They allowed government to search and seize their property, go through their homes, and they lived in fear for several days. Now, if the Second Amendment was used as the way it was originally intended, as a form of self-defense widespread through the population, none of that would have been necessary. How difficult would it have been, assuming that the vast majority of the population were armed, how difficult would it have been to say to everybody, look, he's out there, check your homes, check your backyards, and report in. Everyone would have been armed. The guy would have been caught within 30 minutes without this expense and headache or fear. And I wonder how many people were locked in their homes, in their bedrooms, in their basements, bolted, waiting for the police to arrive, wishing they had a gun.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the things that we mentioned at the beginning of the show tonight. And I wonder, how should the government have responded, do you think? Do you think that they should have even said that? And I guess I wonder what would have happened if an armed citizen had come across suspect number 2 and had shot him. I mean, would that person even be scrutinized for doing that?
Well, there would have been a confrontation, and either the terrorist would have backed down or they would have been shot. There would have been only one resolution. He would have been either captured or caught. And, yes, that citizen probably would be scrutinized. But compare it to what we saw. We saw tanks in the street, armed soldiers. You're talking about average local constabulary police force, and they were armed like an army. They had battle gear. They had machine guns. They had tanks in the street. Mm-hmm. I can't remember the last time a city would ever look like that.
Yeah.
I grew up in New York, and sometimes there were crimes, and they said to the people, hey, look, this guy's loose on the streets, he's dangerous, whatever. We never saw that, and they still caught him anyway. We never saw jack-booted thugs knocking down a door and looking for a person. How dangerous could a 19-year-old be, even if he was armed with a pot of nails and maybe an automatic weapon? How dangerous could he have been? I question a lot of what went on in Boston.
Well, and I think the concerning part is that you basically had martial law for a period of time, and that you had people just willingly go along with it. But I guess the alternative is, or the alternative question is, what else should the government have done? How else should they have handled it?
Well, what you do typically in a situation like that is you quarantine the area, you post policemen at every intersection, and you wait for him to surface. And let me tell you something. He didn't surface until they did that. It wasn't until they said, listen, he may have escaped the area, whatever, start to go about your normal routines. That's when he turned up.
Yep.
I
think you're exactly right.
And something else, I've been watching a lot of the raw footage for Boston. I suspect that some people didn't let those police officers in, and those were the people that were being randomly stopped and arrested or pulled aside or pulled out of their home for their own safety. And that's something that somebody has to go down there and investigate, because I saw quite a few films of them handcuffing certain people, and they were random. Most people, I would assume, let the police in. But I suspect that what happened was when they came to the door and they said, listen, we're coming in, we're searching home, somebody said, no, he's not here. They took that person out, and then they searched the home.
Well, and that's, I guess, the part that concerns me, because at what point do your civil liberties get suspended, and can they, and should they? And that's even another issue about the Miranda rights and the Miranda warning, because he is a citizen, whether we like it or not. The man is a citizen. And so, when you have the Boston mayor coming out and saying, oh, everybody's fine now, he's been caught, there are no further scares, no further concerns, but yet they're saying, oh, well, we need the Miranda period to be suspended so that we can make sure that there's nothing else and, be able to question it. I mean, it's such a hypocritical thing.
It's very disappointing for me to see the Republicans standing on most of the cable news networks asking for Miranda to be suspended. The GOP is supposed to stand for something, and that's constitutional purity. And when an American citizen is being held without Miranda rights, accused of a heinous crime such as this, you have to say to yourself, where's the Constitution in all this? Where are our constitutional protections?
Well, and in this case, it seems like it's the ACLU who's going to be the one standing up for this man instead of the Republican Party. And I mean, I am the first to support. When there are global threats, I am one of the first to support the United States being aggressive. I'm not an isolationist. I certainly am pro-military, pro-fighting when it comes to terrorism and things, but I also think you have to balance that with being very careful about civil liberties, and even things like the Patriot Act, where we thought that it was going to all be used for certain reasons, and some of it is still kind of woven through how we operate. It just doesn't seem like we are getting back to that root of the civil liberty issue, and nobody seems to care. And the Bostonians seem to just all let it happen because they were in such panic.
That's the real concern, that it didn't bother anybody, or it bothered very few people. Not that they were searching people's homes without a search warrant, but that people didn't mind. And that's the real danger. That's when tyranny begins to take hold, because a tyrant can't seize power without the people willingly giving it to him. That's one of the reasons why you'll see a lot of tyrannies around the world. They're democracies, because the people willingly give that power to the tyrant.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk a bit about your book here for a minute as well. I know one of the things that you ask is why restrictions are being placed on guns and gun ownership when crime is at an all-time low. What's the thought process there?
Well, what is going on is we've seen a steady decline in crime, okay? And the question is, what's causing it? Now, most of that decline in recent years has been since 9/11. Right. And the book, I go into that, and I said, my contention is that it's because our local police officers are so heavily armed and we're locking up so many people that we've been gradually converting to a police state. Whether it's intended or not is another debate. But right now, there's a lot of people in this country locked up, and there's very low crime. I think, I don't know what the percentage is, but an enormous amount of our population as a percentage are locked up in prisons. And you're seeing more and more of that. Now, you're seeing a decline in crime rate, but don't forget the assault weapons ban is over now. So there are more guns available to the average citizen and more guns actually in circulation than ever before, yet crime continues to go down. So you can't tell me that guns are a danger. It's not the gun in and of itself, okay? It's what we're doing with them. And that has to go back to our morals and our values in society, which I go into. The book is divided into 4 parts. First, before you can have a debate about whether the gun control is an appropriate answer, you have to understand what the Second Amendment is all about. And so I go into the history, I go into the definition, I go into the Supreme Court rulings and what they say. And then once you establish what the Second Amendment actually is, I go into what the history of it is, what the present situation is, and what the debate is. And then, of course, at the end, the conclusion is, what are we going to do about it?
Well, and one of the big ones that has irked me for a long time, I've been against expanded background checks since the moment that they were mentioned. Mm-hmm. And a lot of Republicans say they're fine. Some of the polling says they're fine. And I am curious what you think about them.
I think most people are going to say, are you for universal background checks? And they'll say yes. And I think a number of polls reflect that. I think that's because most people don't understand what a universal background check can entail. The purpose of the Second Amendment was to provide self-defense for the average person and also to protect our rights against the tyrant. In other words, should the government ever get out of control of the people, should it ever become tyrannical, people have an ability to defeat that tyranny. The Second Amendment was designed to protect us against federal tyranny. Okay, the Constitution is really a document which defines federal laws and federal protections and rights. When you give the federal government the right to register your gun and decide who, in effect, has guns, because let's face it, that's what registration is. The federal government is going to decide who has guns and who doesn't. You're giving that tyrant that power to take your gun away.
Right,
now, I'm not saying that government will do that, but you're transferring that right back to the federal government de facto. If you do that, then you defeat the original intent of the Second Amendment. And I think that if push comes to shove, the Supreme Court will rule that way. Now, they've ruled before in that case. When the Brady Law, when Reagan was shot, the Brady Law, if you're not familiar with it, if you're listening, is when they originally established the first background check that we have now. The Supreme Court already ruled that a federal system would be unconstitutional. And they said that. And that's why most background checks are now a one-way state operation. They don't operate on a two-way basis. In other words, the government doesn't keep any records on you. A universal background check will eventually result in that. Now, whether or not they say it will or that there's checks in the law and balances, you know as well as I do that laws get circumvented all the time, particularly by tyrants.
Yes. Yes. No, and I think that's a good point. And when you look at the background checks and the aspect of implementing those across our society, I think you're exactly right. People don't understand what it entails even technically. If you want to talk about closing the, gun show loopholes specifically, for example, I mean, I suppose an argument could be made there that, okay, if you want to make sure in those kinds of instances that you don't have a criminal walking into a gun show buying a gun. But part of the problem, and where I have a real issue with expanding these background checks, is that you have someone like our Secretary of Homeland Security suggesting that Tea Party people are terrorists. And so if you're a terrorist, you shouldn't be able to buy a gun, right? So at what point do those kinds of things end up on your background check? And then, God-fearing, America-loving Tea Partiers aren't able to buy a gun.
Well, here's the concern. The federal government is going to put the standard on who is acceptably can carry a gun. In other words, listen, he has PTSD from the military. He can't own a gun. Well, he's taking Xanax, and a side effect of the Xanax may not be he's stable. He can't have a gun. Where do you stop? Especially if you do get a tyrant in power. Since now the control is completely upon the federal government and its bureaucracy, it can decide anything. It could decide, listen, he doesn't go to work every day. That makes him an irresponsible person. He doesn't get a gun. Going back to the original comment about the gun shows, you make the case like, we don't want mental incompetence to get guns, and you don't want them selling them to anyone. I'm a hard liner. I say I don't care who buys a gun and who owns a gun. The penalty for misusing a gun, such as killing someone or committing a crime with it, is far greater than breaking the law on the registration of a gun. So what kind of disincentive do you have for someone to buy a gun illegally? In other words, the person who's going to go out and buy a gun and shoot somebody isn't going to be stopped by a gun registration law.
You would say then, I guess, would you say that we shouldn't have background checks, period? Is that
No,
what
I would say that the current system, the way it works, a one-way system through the states is ideal, because you have some sort of stopgap against a completely deranged individual from getting them, but there are no records checked and nothing is held against you. The current system is very effective. In the book, it goes into this. It's very effective for keeping guns out of the people's hands that we don't want. But between two individuals, let's say if I was to try and sell you a gun, right now it's legal. I know it is in the state of Arizona without providing a background check. If you met me somewhere at a coffee shop and I decided to sell you a gun, that's perfectly legal. It would not be under most universal background checks that are proposed. And I think that's wrong. I think I should be allowed to sell you a weapon.
Yeah, certainly. No,
it's a restriction of free trade, if not only the Second Amendment rights.
Yeah. No, and I think that's part of why this bill in the Senate this past week was defeated, because you can't get into a situation where you have restricted gun ownership so that you start that slippery slope. And, you had the left just explode this week when that bill was defeated and act like it was just the end of all common sense. But I don't think that, and I fault our education system for this one. I don't think that most people understand why the Second Amendment was there to begin with, and that if you have a tyrannical government and you have to defend yourself against it, if I want to own an Abrams tank, I should, according to the Second Amendment, if you want to really look at it from the point of defending yourself against a tyrannical government, I should have the right to do that.
I go into that in the book, because a lot of liberals will say, then you want everyone to own tanks. And I said, no, the Second Amendment specifically applies to personal arms, and it's been ruled by the Supreme Court as such. In other words, handguns, rifles, that sort of thing, and not tanks, military hardware. I suppose from a theoretical point of view it would, but realistically,
I'm saying it
the
in a
Second
theoretical
Amendment
point
applies
of view.
only to personal arms.
We
don't want, somebody who's listening to this show will say, Tom Purcell wants everybody to own nuclear weapons and tanks, and that's far from the question. But, getting back to the Democrats were very angry about that gun control bill, and it's true, they were. Obama was extremely angry at his press conference. The reason they were angry was not because that it puts people at risk or puts children at risk, or even that his gun control bill was necessary for the safety of the government. He was mad because now that it was defeated in the Senate, he couldn't, because he knew that would never get past the House. He was mad because he couldn't put this on the House and use it as a tool to beat them over the head with in the next election. He wanted to be able to have it pass the Senate, go to the House, have the House defeat it, and then say, Republicans, see, they're not for your safety. And that's why you should vote them out of office. That's what it was all about. It was not about gun control.
Yeah. So let me understand, just to be clear, and we only have about two minutes left, but just to be real clear here, as far as the Second Amendment goes and where you think it applies. So you are saying that you think that anyone should be able to own a personal firearm,
right,
without a background check, but that does not extend
without a federal background check, and I make that clear in the book, that a state one-way background check from a public seller to a private party should be legal. That's the way it is now. The way it exists now is fair, equitable, and has been upheld by the Supreme Court as being fair and equitable, and within the Second Amendment as written.
Well, it's interesting, I think, to make that kind of a distinction. And so, of course, too, for readers who are interested in that brings us back to your book. And we will have a link to Shotgun Republic at thebrennerbrief.com if you'd like to be able to purchase the book, and certainly encourage that, because it sounds like, I know it just came out, and so I look forward to getting my copy, too, because it sounds like you really go into a lot of details that a lot of people don't really know about.
Yeah, and that was the whole point of the book. It goes into the Supreme Court decisions. And by the way, that's not my opinion about the state and the background check. That's the Supreme Court's opinion, and it's in the book. Right.
Great. Well, Thomas, thank you so much for being on the show tonight. I certainly appreciate it, and we'll look forward to reading your book soon.
On.
Good. I'm glad. Well, thanks so much, and we'll look forward. When's your next column going to publish?
Let's see. Every Friday it comes out on the Brenner Brief, and
it'll be out on Friday.
Yes, and I last week's column was on the North Korean crisis,
right?
And this week is going to be, I think, on the Boston issue and on our constitutional rights of search and seizure.
Great. Looking forward to it. Well, thanks so much. We'll have you back on soon. Thanks.